Welcome to This Explainer. You know, for thousands of years, the absolute experts on plants and human anatomy weren't guys in white coats with fancy medical degrees. They were women, midwives, village elders, healers. They passed down this massive, brilliant body of wisdom generation after generation. Today, we're diving into the dark, kind of mysterious, but ultimately super empowering true history of how that profound connection to natural healing was completely severed under the guise of witchcraft, and exactly how we can start to reclaim it today. To really get a feel for this dark historical backdrop, you gotta hear this quote from the 10th century Canon Episcopi. It literally calls it heretical superstition to believe in wicked women riding beasts in the middle of the night. It perfectly captures this terrifying atmosphere of paranoia that began suffocating local healers. Because for centuries, plant-based healing and pagan traditions kind of just coexisted with early Christianity, but eventually, those innocent ancestral practices, that deep respect for the earth, were systematically branded as actual devil worship. So right off the bat, we've got to totally separate that mythical green-faced cartoon witch you see every Halloween from actual historical reality. Because the truth is a tale of persecuted botanical brilliance. These were wise women practicing highly effective natural healing arts. I mean, they were the absolute closest thing most everyday people had to real medical care. If your kid had a fever or you had a bad wound, you didn't go to a hospital. You went to the cunning woman down the lane because she knew exactly which leaves and roots could literally save your life. Okay, so let's look at who these original village healers actually were. Way before modern pharmacies were even a thought, human health relied entirely on this revered ancient wisdom. And we see this across every single ancient culture. From Mesopotamia to Egypt, working with plants wasn't just some fringe folklore. It was a deeply respected, highly organized science. Just to put it into perspective, 5,000 years ago, Mesopotamian clay tablets were already listing over 250 plants, including willow bark, complete with specific dosages. The Egyptian Ebris papyrus had over 700 remedies. And over in India and China, they developed these massive, highly sophisticated traditions that span millennia. Across the whole globe, healers were the essential bridge between human survival and the natural world. And that brings us to this incredibly stark contrast between the superstitious myths of demonic magic we've all been sold and the deeply grounded pharmacological reality of what was actually happening. These women were not standing around casting magical spells. They were observing, they were experimenting, they were carefully refining incredibly vital medical data over thousands of years. But of course, that widespread respect couldn't last forever. The turning point really begins with the rise of the universities. It's wild to think about, but the institutional shift that totally doomed the village healer didn't actually start with witch trials. It started with medical licenses. In 1140, King Roger II mandated medical licenses in Sicily. But here's the catch. To get one, you had to attend a university. And guess who was strictly forbidden from stepping foot inside a university? Women. So, as the timeline shifted over the next few centuries, moving through France in 1271 and Paris in 1322, the actual practice of medicine was legally boxed in and restricted entirely to a small, elite class of educated men. If you want to see exactly how backward this logic was, just listen to the judges from the 1322 trial of Jacqueline Felice in Paris. They literally said allowing her to practice would set a dangerous precedent because it would suggest medicine could be learned outside a university. They didn't care that her herbal remedies worked. Multiple patients testified in court that she saved them when the licensed doctors completely failed. But the judges, they only cared that she threatened their institutional monopoly. It wasn't about whether her healing worked, it was about whether she had the official paperwork to use it. So what exactly were these women using? Let's take a quick walk inside the notorious witch's garden. When we actually demystify the magic, we find that these weren't ingredients for dark spells. They were incredibly potent, historically significant plants. Take mandrake and henbane. These were powerful sedatives and painkillers used for excruciating things like tooth extractions. Then you have belladonna, which, when dosed perfectly, eased intense muscle spasms and brought down fevers. And this is a huge one: pennyroyal and rue. These plants were utilized for vital reproductive control. They allowed women to manage their own fertility, which, as you can imagine, was a practice the church and the new medical establishment desperately wanted to shut down. Now pay close attention to this because it explains exactly where those wild stories of witchcraft actually came from. It all comes down to terpene alkaloids. These are insanely powerful chemical compounds found in nightshades, like belladonna and henbane. They induce heavy sedation, deep dissociation, and intensely vivid hallucinations. And those cunning women of Europe, they had absolutely mastered how to use them. Which brings us to the famous flying ointment. It turns out the witches weren't entirely lying about flying. They had just stumbled upon a profoundly sophisticated method of drug delivery. Because they knew that eating these nightshades could be deadly, they mixed the tropane alkaloid-rich plants with a fat-based salve and rubbed it right onto their skin. This completely bypassed the digestive system, absorbing directly into the bloodstream and inducing these massive out-of-body hallucinations of flight. No magic brooms required, it was just pure, highly advanced pharmacology. Tragically, this exact pharmacological brilliance is what triggered a total war on the Wive women. This incredible knowledge directly provoked a really dark era of fear and brutal societal upheaval. In 1486, the infamous witch-hunting manual, the Malleus Maleficarum, was published, and it totally weaponized this terrifying logic against midwives and herbalists everywhere. It essentially claimed that any woman who could cure illnesses without formal training was obviously drawing her power from the devil. Think about how twisted that is. If a peasant woman cured a disease that an educated doctor couldn't, she was immediately suspected of a demonic pact. Understanding plants deeply literally became a crime. And this fear-mongering built into a horrifyingly standardized process, the witch trial. It almost always started with some random local misfortune. A crop failed, or a cow got sick, and the local healer was instantly blamed. Authorities would search her home, and simply discovering a jar of everyday healing herbs or a mortar and pestle was taken as hard evidence. Then came brutal, unimaginable torture to extract totally false confessions. These women would say anything, name anyone, just to make the pain stop, which ultimately led to a public execution by burning or hanging. Just take a second to let this staggering number sink in. 40 to 60,000. That is the estimated death toll across Europe between 1450 and 1750. Tens of thousands of people executed, and roughly 80% of them were women. Think about Agnes Sampson in Scotland, who was strangled and burned in 1591 simply because she cured people the doctors could not. These were women whose only real crime was simply understanding the natural world better than the men in power. And we absolutely have to acknowledge that this war on traditional healers wasn't just a European tragedy. It was a devastating global pattern of colonial suppression. Spanish missionaries burned Aztec medical codices and banned their traditional healers. Across North America and Africa, colonial governments systematically suppressed Native American medicine people and African herbalists, completely dismissing their deeply complex traditions as mere superstition. It resulted in the tragic, systematic loss of millennia of indigenous botanical knowledge. But here is where the story takes a massive turn, because eventually modern science stepped in to validate the magic. In the 20th century, modern laboratories started looking into these old remedies. And guess what? They didn't invent our most crucial medicines from scratch, not even close. They simply isolated the active chemical compounds from the exact same plants those cunning women had been using for centuries. That willow bark from ancient Mesopotamia, it gave us salicylic acid, which is aspirin. Foxglove gave us digitalis for heart failure. And belladonna, that same plant the witch hunters called a literal tool of the devil, gives us atropine, which is an absolutely essential eye and heart medication today. So the biggest takeaway here is that these traditional pharmacopoeias were never, ever superstition. They were rigorous, vital data sets that modern science relies heavily on to this very day. In fact, a whopping 25% of all modern pharmaceutical drugs are derived directly from plants, and the vast majority of those were identified simply by asking traditional healers what they had already been using all along. The witches were totally right about the plants. Which brings us to the most important part of this whole explainer: reclaiming that ancient plant wisdom for ourselves. When we look back at the horrific suppression of these wise women, it is crystal clear that it was never about whether the plants actually worked. It was 100% about power. It was about controlling who had the right to use them. Plants, by their very nature, are the ultimate equalizer. They grow in the dirt right outside your door. You don't need a medical license, and you don't need a king's permission to harvest them. The witch hunts were just a concerted effort to rip medical autonomy right out of the hands of the marginalized. But here's the beautiful part. Today, we can bypass those authority structures and reclaim that empowerment using safe, simple, everyday garden herbs. You don't need a complex apothecary to practice natural, at-home, no side-effect remedies. You can brew some chamomile for a stomachache or simply apply fresh aloe topically to a burn. Keep some ginger around to completely soothe nausea. Grow a little lavender on your windowsill to promote natural sleep, or use fresh mint to aid digestion. Anyone, literally anyone, can safely use these at home, restoring that accessible, empowering healing that history tried so hard to erase. So, I'm going to leave you with this final, provocative thought. Every single time you brew a simple cup of chamomile tea or rub a little aloe on a sunburn, you are doing so much more than just treating a symptom. You are engaging in a powerful act of historical rebellion. You're keeping their legacy alive and proving that those ancient wise women absolutely did not die in vain. So what ancient plant knowledge are you going to grow in your own garden today? Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and until next time, keep learning and keep growing.